Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here today. This is an opportune time with everything going on in our world right now. My name is Carolyn Eulenhake-Walker. As a teacher, my name was Miss U. But I wanted to say how honored I am to introduce Dr. Joseph Gerson on his issue of nuclear weapons. Dr. Gerson is the president of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security. He has long been a leading figure in the American and international nuclear disarmament movement, beginning with his role in helping to launch the nuclear weapons freeze movement of the 1980s, all the way up to today. He has also written several books. They're out there for purchase. One is called With Hiroshima Eyes, Atomic War, Nuclear Extortion, and Moral Imagination. The second book, Empire and the Bomb, Nuclear Weapons to Dominate the World. We are extremely honored today to have Dr. Gerson with us. Please join me in giving him a warm Iowa welcome.
Carolyn, and thank you for that very generous introduction. I will say that I have difficulties with the word honor, right? I mean, we're just people who, as one friend said years ago, you put your pants on one leg at a time, and then you do the best that you can do. Let me begin by thanking the Catholic Peace Mission for the opportunity to be with you today. It's something like, as Kathleen was saying, something like ancient history. Kathleen and I were colleagues at the American Friends Service Committee, and I can remember driving across the state one night to get to one of the universities in the dark and wondering if we were on the right road. And this was before GPS, so the question was, we're going to drive off the end of the universe. My subject, has been said, is nuclear weapons in the military-industrial complex, which I'm sure is not going to leave you dancing in these aisles. But given Des Moines' great history, including the Mayor Cowie, who did such wonderful work joining Mayors for Peace and then winning the resolutions from the U.S. Conference of Mayors for nuclear disarmament, I at least hope you'll hang with me as I go through a somewhat detailed talk. A week ago, I experienced, as I mentioned, experienced emotional whiplash. Having worked with Japanese and other atomic hydrogen bomb survivors for the past 40 years, I was beyond excited by the news that Hidakio had been announced that they would get the Nobel Peace Prize. Having been involved in nominating for the award, even at my age, I was literally bouncing off the walls. My wife can testify. Then on Sunday, the New York Times devoted a full 4 pages of the New York Times, in its Sunday Opinion edition, to the massive U.S. industrial, scientific, and social complexes that have been mobilized for the $1.7 trillion so-called modernization program that is underway in 50 states, modernization of our nuclear arsenal. This is to upgrade and replace the Pentagon's entire nuclear arsenal and its air, naval, and ground launch delivery systems for the rest of the 21st century. In the Pentagon, they don't have a nuclear weapons-free world in mind. The article demonstrated the historian E.P. Thompson's truth that the U.S. and back then the Soviet Union, quote, don't have military-industrial complexes. They are such complexes. Absent from the article was the reality that the Pentagon has just launched and is now deeply involved in a 2-week-long steadfast news exercise to practice for nuclear war. It's not a distraction. I have a lot to cover, so please bear with me as I describe some of the important of the meaning of Pinocchio's Nobel Peace Prize, how we are now living in the world's most dangerous moment since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Additionally, I'll describe what nuclear weapons do, how they've been used since the Nagasaki bombing. I will then outline some of the dimensions of the military-industrial congressional university complex and conclude on a more hopeful note. I just want to say in terms of size, the rafters are not full here, but I am remembering that it was a very, very small group of people who launched the nuclear weapons movement. Initially, several graduate students and a professor at MIT, and then a small band of my colleagues at the American Defense Service Committee, with one guy having the absolutely ridiculous idea of taking it to town meetings in Vermont. So just to appreciate what a small group of people can do in Iowa. Let's begin with a short but maybe unnecessary primer on what nuclear weapons actually do. On the eve of the 50th anniversary of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, Ian Baruma, kind of a journalist scholar, wrote that, quote, "It's even harder to imagine what happened in Hiroshima than it is at Auschwitz, for the horror of Hiroshima was compressed into a singular event, which left hardly a visual trace." The physicist Naomi Shohono, herself a hibakusha, provided a scientific description of what happened. And remember that by today's standards, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs were small weapons. Shohono explained that the devastation came in three waves. In the first second, which is to say in the first second, a poisonous wave of radiation spread across a radius of 2 miles in a second. Then came the blast wave destroying the city. That was followed by a heat wave that burned the city and its people. Shohono wrote that, quote, "At the moment of the explosion, a fireball with temperatures of several millions of degrees centigrade, and an atmospheric pressure of several 100,000 bars was formed at the burst point. Buildings were smashed smashed to pieces and incinerated. And it was the great quantities of dust from the destroyed buildings carried by the winds that cast the city into pitch darkness after the bombing. The violent winds also tossed people around, as in people were literally flown through the air by the pressure. Many died as a result of the concussions that followed. As the fireball disappeared, the vacuum around the burst point pulled in dust, air, and the evaporated material of the bombing, causing mushroom clouds to rise. Because of the combined effects of the blast, the thermal rays, fires, almost all buildings within about 2 kilometers of the hypocenter were completely razed and consumed by the fire in an instant. When you see the images of the mushroom cloud, you are seeing more than the detritus of an A-bomb home, shop, factory, road, or bridge. You are also seeing incinerated remains of many human beings. On the 50th anniversary, the post office thought about bringing out a postage stamp with the mushroom cloud. That was snatched, but just to think about that. 120,000 people were killed almost immediately, 210,000 by year's end. The city's hospitals were destroyed. Half the doctors and nurses were killed. There was severe lack of medicines and bandages, and who knew what to do? Who knew what radiation was then? People and their loved ones, who they thought had survived, later succumbed to radiation diseases. In the months that followed, mutant babies, including jellyfish babies, were born. Over the years, many died from cancer, and because so little was known publicly then about radiation, for many years hibakusha were shunned out of fear that radiation disease could be contagious. And to this day, third-generation hibakusha are sometimes denied marriage partners, out of fear of genetic damage. Several years ago, Physicians for Social Responsibility, in association with some of the nation's most highly respected environmental scientists, issued a report on the consequences of a comparatively small nuclear exchange, use of 50 to 100 tactical nuclear weapons in a war between India and Pakistan. In the first hour, hundreds of millions of people would be killed, with more poisoned and dying in the days and weeks that followed. But worse, the fires ignited by the nuclear weapons would create immense amounts of smoke that would drift over the northern hemisphere. That smoke would block the sun's rays, and instead of global warming, we would have global cooling, which would devastate the world's agriculture, and as the report said, leading to global famine and the deaths of up to 2 billion people. Billion is a number I still haven't quite managed to wrap my head around. As we've known since the physicist Carl Sagan's 1980 studies, thermonuclear exchange between great powers would cause nuclear winter and the deaths of almost everyone on the planet. I'm sorry to be saying this in the presence of this young fellow here. It's the world that you're born into, I'm sorry. In 1985, under popular pressure, that report contributed to President Reagan finally joining Mikhail Gorbachev in conceding that no one can win a nuclear war and that therefore nuclear war must not be fought. But lessons are not always remembered. Let me say a few words about deterrence theory, which has long served to legitimate U.S. and other nuclear powers' arsenals and war plans. That dangerous doctrine is rarely critically examined or reviewed, even as it is widely recognized that the launch of a single tactical nuclear weapon could escalate to a civilization-ending nuclear exchange. Annie Jacobson has a new and important book, Nuclear War Scenario, in which she provides a chilling description of what could happen if deterrence fails. The end of the world as we know it in 72 minutes. It is chilling. The popular understanding of nuclear deterrence is that no nuclear power will attack another with its nuclear arsenal unless it is attacked first. Few remember that the initial draft of the Bush-Cheney doctrine for joint nuclear operations was clear. It stated, and I quote, "The focus of U.S. deterrence efforts is to influence potential adversaries to withhold actions intended to harm U.S. interests. Our oil, for example, under their sand. And in the past, the U.S. has prepared and threatened to initiate nuclear attacks, at least on 30 occasions, most recently in relationship to the two Iraq wars. There are numerous ways that deterrence can fail. Among them, technical failures, such as when an early warning system misreads a flight of geese, when the wrong cassette is placed in a computer, or when a nuclear power's bluff is called. And again, when a launch signal is mistakenly sent to Okinawa, as happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, let me turn then to the Hibakusha. Wilfred Burchett was the first Western journalist to witness the ruins and suffering of Hiroshima in 1945. And he later wrote that Hibakusha transformed their excruciating physical and emotional suffering into the world's most powerful force for the abolition of nuclear weapons. With the award of this year's Nobel Peace Prize, their tortured testimonies and their truth that human beings and nuclear weapons cannot coexist will now ring much more powerfully around the world and provide new openings to reduce and hopefully eliminate the danger of nuclear apocalypse. So this is really a special moment in human history. Because we sometimes feel powerless, let's take a moment to marvel at and learn from the Hibakusha. I mean, I've learned so much from them and taken courage from the way they've lived their lives. Like other Japanese during the war in the Pacific, they were seen by U.S. leaders and the media as, quote, vermin to be exterminated. But the leaders of their movement have awakened the conscience of the world after suffering the world's single worst war crime. And contrary to Truman's mythology that the A-bombs were needed to defeat Japan, recall that senior U.S. military officials, including Eisenhower, LeMay, Leahy, they all told Truman it wasn't necessary to hit the Japanese for that awful thing. And Secretary of War Stimson had advised Truman that Japan's surrender could be arranged on terms acceptable to the United States before the A-bombing. It's detailed in the books I have out there. Suffering their own serious wounds and agonies, many Hibakusha were unable to save their families in the shattered and burning homes. They witnessed ghost-like figures no longer recognizable as human beings, some holding their eyeballs or their intestines in their hands, staggering to their deaths, often in cisterns or in the city's rivers. In the months and years that followed, many died from their wounds, from radiation-inflicted cancers, and other diseases. Memories remain of giving birth to mutant babies and other children whose lives were cut short by radiation diseases. With initial fears that radiation diseases might be contagious, I think I've been there already, we'll go there. Their suffering was compounded by marginalization. People were afraid to touch, see, or be with Hibakusha because of the fear of the radiation itself. And as a result of the U.S. military occupation of Japan, which continued until 1952, and subsequently with Japan functioning as the United States' subservient ally, essential medical and other support services were long denied to Hibakusha. There were also thousands of Korean A-bomb victims. We don't hear much about them. Many of whom had been shipped from their conquered Korea, which was a colony of Japan, beginning in 1905. They were there as forced laborers, and so many of them were either killed in the atomic bombing or became hibakusha, and when they went back to Korea, for a whole variety of reasons, they were even further marginalized. With hibakusha's testimonies in communities across the world and at the UN, they have forged a powerful but still inadequate taboo against the use of nuclear weapons. With their testimonies at the UN and elsewhere, they've played critical roles in winning the majority of the world's governments to understanding that for the human species to survive, priority must be given not to state interests in diplomacy, but to humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. Hibakusha's testimonies were essential to the successful negotiation of the 2017 Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and that treaty seeks to hold the nuclear weapons states accountable to their obligation under Article 6 in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We don't think about that very much, but that is a commitment to engage in good faith negotiations with complete elimination of their arsenals. The nuclear weapons have not been used since the Nagasaki A-bombing was an unfortunate misstatement in the Nobel Prize Committee's award announcement. As Daniel Ellsberg, a principal author of the U.S. nuclear war planning in the Kennedy administration, taught, during many international crises and wars, the U.S. has used its nuclear arsenal in the same way that an armed robber uses his gun in a heist. Whether or not the trigger is pulled, the gun has been used. And this is the playbook, unfortunately, that Putin is playing from since the Ukraine war, modeling after what the United States has done. Okay, let me turn then to threats that we face today. Nihon and Nokia, along with this is pretty much unknown. The first Godzilla film was actually an anti-nuclear film. It was cleansed and deracinated for showing in the United States. It became a love story. But I actually met one of the lead actors, and it was made out of rage at what had happened not only Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but then the Bravo H-bomb test in 1954. That bomb, H-bomb, was 1,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima A-bomb. It irradiated Japanese fishermen, people in the Marshall Islands, and Japan's food supply. And it was out of that the First World Conference against H-bombs was held in Hiroshima, and that the Hidankyo organization emerged. My guess is that in the committee's, that with the award here, it's the committee's own desperate way of crying out that we face the greatest danger of nuclear apocalypse since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that we must focus world attention on the urgency of renewing disarmament diplomacy. In addition to Russian nuclear threats related to Ukraine, an accident, an incident, or miscalculation growing out of provocative U.S., Allied, or Chinese military operations in and around Taiwan or the South China Sea could all too easily escalate to a nuclear confrontation. The Nobel Committee knows that with fears of a possible Trump election victory, There are growing demands among Japanese and South Korean elites for their nations to become nuclear powers. Zelensky has just said if he can't get the peace he wants, Ukraine should become a nuclear power. And they also know that there is increased and renewed advocacy in Europe for the French or the British nuclear arsenals to serve as a nuclear umbrella, since they feel like they can't trust Trump. As we face the existential dangers of possible nuclear war, just as you have to address the causes of any disease in order, not just the symptoms, we have to be honest and address the forces that are driving nuclear confrontations. We're dealing with 20th and 21st century versions of gunboat diplomacy, but it's a whole lot worse this time around. In a recent confidential discussion with current and former U.S., Russian, and European arms control negotiators and analysts, a number of profoundly disturbing points were raised. China is expanding its nuclear arsenal, and we are now 3 scorpions in a bottle instead of 2. This makes diplomacy a whole lot more difficult. More urgently, the U.S. and Russia have reduced the operational threshold in which they would fire their nuclear weapons. There is a danger that with the Ukraine war, the nuclear deterrence paradigm has already failed. And finally, as we approach next month's election, in Washington, nuclear weapons and war analysts are competing with one another to see who can create the most hawkish paradigm for what our policy should be, with the hope of getting its support from either Trump or from Harris. Let me ask, how many people here saw Nolan's film Oppenheimer? The rest of you should see it. Nolan reminded us that nuclear weapons grew out of the amazing dynamics of the 20th century, early 20th century physicists, as they discovered and explored the atom's structure and its power. And that was followed by the U.S. race to build a deterrent nuclear A-bomb before Germany could have an offensive A-bomb. But what's not known widely is that by 1942, it was known in the highest circles of U.S. power that Germany was not going to have an A-bomb in time for use in the war. And when Joseph Rotblat, later a Nobel Peace Laureate, was then a senior scientist when he arrived as a senior scientist at Los Alamos, General Groves, who directed the project in 1942, tells him the bomb is no longer about Germany. Didn't say it was about Japan. It was about the Soviet Union. And that we need to remember. And it's out of Los Alamos that the foundations of today's military, industrial, congressional, university complex were born. Like many of my generation, in my youth, I read Hersey's book, Hiroshima, the first major description of the devastation of that city to be published in the United States. But the danger of nuclear weapons didn't hit me until October 1973. Working in Europe, I was attending a meeting in Copenhagen. The war in the Middle East, designed to reverse Israel's 1967 conquest, was believed to have ended, and attention had returned to the Watergate scandal. Thinking the Middle East war over, I was shocked to awake and hear on Armed Forces Radio that U.S. nuclear forces were on alert. My first thought was that as Watergate was drawing to its climax, Nixon might be attempting a coup. I even called my friends back in the United States to see if that was happening. And in fact, we later learned that Secretary of Defense Schlesinger did have fears that Nixon might try to pull a military coup. And he had ordered that there be no significant troop movements without this explicit order. But here's what happened. Once the Israeli army had defeated Egyptian President Sadat's forces, a ceasefire was negotiated. As Sadat's Third Army fell back across the Sinai Peninsula, with green lights from Henry Kissinger, Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir and the Israeli forces disregarded the ceasefire. They kept pushing Egyptian troops further back, surrounded them, and denied them food and water. Desperate to prevent further humiliation and the loss of his army, Sadat notified Kissinger and the Russians And just to say, Kissinger at that point, with Nixon drinking himself into stupor, Kissinger he was functional commander-in-chief at that time. In any event, Sadat sends this notice to Kissinger and to Brezhnev that he would appeal to the UN the next day, asking them to authorize U.S. and Soviet forces to intervene and enforce the ceasefire. That was when Kissinger ordered the nuclear alert. He had managed to ensure that the outcome of the war would result in expanded U.S. influence and control in the Middle East. The last thing he wanted was to open the field to the Soviets. So he ordered the nuclear alert. And at the same time, he also insisted that Golda respect the ceasefire. And that's how the war came to an end. That was when I began to understand what we call the deadly connection, the relationship between U.S. foreign military interventions and nuclear war. I deepened that understanding in conversations with Daniel Ellsberg and learned that before 1973, during wars, crises, and coups, the U.S. had prepared and threatened to initiate first-strike nuclear attacks in relationship to Iran, China, Lebanon, Iraq, Vietnam, Cuba, and Guatemala. This is before 73. This is nuclear blackmail. It's the same model that Putin is using. And I regret to say that each of the other nuclear powers has similarly prepared and or threatened nuclear attack at least once. Since 1973, the U.S. has threatened Iraq, China, North Korea, and Libya with first-strike nuclear attacks. And Robert O'Brien, Donald Trump's national security advisor, recently wrote that during Trump's fire and fury threats against North Korea, we came much closer to nuclear war than anyone understands. And O'Brien is seen as Trump's probable national security advisor should he come to power after the election. Of course, there is context, and my wife advises me to tread lightly and kindly as I approach it. She's sensitive. During the Cold War, there was a powerful taboo against using the terms empire and imperialism. But during the Cold War, during the post-Cold War unipolar era, the blinkers were removed. Karl Rove, and some of you will remember who Karl Rove was, President W. Bush's senior advisor. He was quoted on the front page of the New York Times Sunday magazine as saying, "We're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. And while you're studying that reality, we'll act again, creating other new realities. We are history's actors." One of the candidates for president seems to be communicating that same vision. As you likely know, the authors of our Constitution were inspired by the models of the Greek, Roman, French, and British empires. Believing it could be more easily manipulated by the elite, they opted for a larger metropolitan center with more kinds of people with different interests so that the elite could manipulate them more easily. After the Continental Empire was conquered through military actions and genocide, in 1898, the U.S. launched its international empire with the Spanish-American War, taking Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Caribbean, and exercising control over northern Latin America. And then with the conquest of the Philippines, Guam, Samoa, it had the stepping stones to the holy grail of capitalism, as was described, the China market. We're back there today. And with the end of World War II, the Pacific became what was called an American lake. And the U.S., of course, absorbed many of France and Britain's domains. More than a military was needed to hold the imperial sphere in place. Of course, we did have Eisenhower's recognition that we couldn't police the empire with our military, just take millions and millions of troops. So he came to rely on kind of overwhelming nuclear threats as a way to ensure that our power wasn't changed. But we also had international institutions like the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, the Bretton Woods Agreement, which were largely created and imposed by the United States. That's what's called today the rules-based order. But the reality is that the former colonial world, The Chinese, to a lesser extent the Russians, had no say in the creation of that rules-based order. It wasn't designed for their interests. And now as they have increased their power and influence, they're saying, let's equalize this global system so that we also can share in the benefits of this system or to revise it. And so we have, get back to my text here. So we're in what the Italian political prisoner, actually, Antonio Gramsci wrote. We're in an interregnum. We're in what he called the time of monsters. While the old world is dying and the new world is struggling to be born. And out of those tensions and uncertainties, we have the Ukraine war, we have Gaza and its ramifications across the Middle East. We even have now South Africa taking Israel to the International Court of Justice, right? I mean, talk about an inversion of values and the West being called to account for its so-called rules-based order. Okay. Let me say a little bit more about wars and mounting dangers. Halloween is coming, so I'm going to scare you. And I'll add to the list of horrors. UN General Secretary Guterres, who I think is just a wonderful person, warns that, quote, the world is becoming unhinged as geopolitical tensions rise, and it seems incapable of coming together to respond to mounting challenges. There are, in fact, disturbing parallels between the forces that triggered the First World War and today. Complex alliance structures, intensifying nationalism, territorial competition, economic integration and intense competition, and wild card actors. Yet, unlike Sarajevo in 1914, an incident, accident, or miscalculation, as I said before, could trigger escalation to thermonuclear war. With the Ukraine war, we face the dangers of political and military miscalculations leading to vertical, which is to say weapons, or geographic, or horizontal, which is to say geographic escalation, geographic. After its many threats, what might happen if the Kremlin's response, what might we have as the Kremlin's response if President Biden okays and provides the necessary technical assistance for Kiev to launch long-range missiles at Russian cities or military bases? Or if a senior Russian political leader is killed by a Ukrainian drone in Moscow? Or how would Moscow respond if a Russian missile misfunctions and, or purposely, hits Polish targets? Ukraine and Gaza have served as the murderous escape valves for the pressures of tectonic political changes. They were building beneath the surface throughout the post-Cold War period. With my once having been a Middle East specialist, Luke asked me to focus at least some of my remarks on the escalating Middle East war. Israel, after all, is a nuclear weapons state, and it has threatened in the past to use its chemical weapons during the first stages of the 1973 war. And until earlier this week, there were fears that Israel would attack Iran's nuclear infrastructure. There is also the possibility that Iran, humiliated by its military setbacks, will take a lesson from North Korea and expedite its development of nuclear weapons. My purpose here is not to have you go out and slit your throat, but we just need to know where we're living. At root, as Yasser Arafat told the delegation I participated in just over 30 years ago, it is cowboys and Indians all over again. European anti-Semitism appeared to climax in the Nazi Holocaust, leading to the creation of the Zionist anti-Semitism, leading to the creation of the Zionist movement, which promised a land for people, a land without people, for people without a land. However, like Iowa and the rest of this country, it was a land with people, with superior weapons and other advanced technologies, and brutal ethnic cleansing. Colonial settlements followed in Israel and in the Palestinian territories conquered in 1967, just as they did here in the United States. Neither the Arab states nor Israel fully Neither the Arab states nor Israel fully accepted the 1947 partition plan, resulting in the 1948 and 1967 wars. Also the creation of an apartheid Israeli state and the Palestinian Nakba. The 1967 Six-Day War was actually not a war for Israel's survival. I don't have time here, but we could talk about it if you wish. It left Israel occupying, as an occupying military and colonial power over the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza, and the Golan Heights. And Palestinians have understandably resisted since then. Then to the history and preparations of nuclear threats to initiate nuclear war in the Middle East. It began in 1948. During World War II, when the U.S. and the Soviets were allies, President Roosevelt encouraged Moscow's occupation of Iran in order to facilitate the supply of weapons to Russia by Iran in order to defeat Hitler. After the war, the Soviets were slow to withdraw from Iran. Given the centrality of oil in the industrial era, Truman drew his nuclear gun. He warned Moscow's ambassador to Washington that if the Soviets did not begin their withdrawal within 48 hours, Moscow would cease to exist. The withdrawal began within 24 hours. During the 1956 crisis, when Israel invaded Egypt at Britain's and France's behest, Soviet Prime Minister or Premier Bulganin threatened London and Paris with a nuclear attack that he probably could not have implemented. And President Eisenhower responded with a nuclear threat of his own and applied financial pressure, especially on Britain and France, that forced the withdrawal. American presidents actually can exercise leverage over Israel and its allies. And then after that, part out of French guilt, having lured Israel to launch the invasion, they collaborated with Israeli Prime Minister Shimon Peres to create Israel's nuclear bomb. In 1958, during the first spasm of what later became the Lebanese Civil War, the U.S. positioned nuclear weapons off the Lebanese coast and threatened to use them. Soon thereafter, Eisenhower threatened to use those same weapons against Iraq in order to prevent a left-wing coup. In 1970, President Nixon signaled U.S. preparations to initiate nuclear war during Black September in Jordan. And 3 years later, in the first defensive throes of the October War, as I said, Golda Meir threatened Israel's Temple weapons in order, basically a threat against Kissinger, in order to get the U.S. to open the floodgate of spare parts and new weapons supplies. In 1980, following the Soviet, this is America that we don't even imagine exists, right? In 1980, following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the Islamic Revolution in Iran, President Carter announced his doctrine that the U.S. would use any means necessary, which implicitly includes nuclear weapons, to reinforce U.S. vital interests across the Middle East. And the following year, President Reagan reaffirmed the Carter doctrine. In the run-up to the 1991 Gulf War, President George H.W. Bush, Vice President Cheney, and British Prime Minister Major all threatened Iraq with nuclear attack if Hussein preemptively used chemical weapons as U.S. forces and the Allied forces were gathering to push back the Iraqi forces. That threat was repeated during the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and my classmate Bill Clinton threatened Libya and Iraq with nuclear attacks in 1996 and 1998. And in 2006, W. Bush communicated an implicit threat to bomb Iran's nuclear infrastructure. If somebody give me a little bit of water, that might help. And I promise you the end is beginning to become exciting. To the north, with help from a Pakistani nuclear weapons designer, Iran developed this nuclear infrastructure. Since President Trump pulled out of the nuclear deal negotiated by President Obama, Iran's sophisticated centrifuges have brought Tehran within a hair's breadth of nuclear weapons capability. Restrained, at least for now, by a religious fatwa prohibiting possession of nuclear weapons, and fears that Saudi Arabia would develop its own nuclear weapon in response, Tehran has proceeded cautiously. But continuing revelation is not something new to the world's religions. Thank you, Ken. Okay, let's turn to the military-industrial complex. With this With this unpleasant history of empire out of our way, let's turn to the nuclear dimensions of the military-industrial congressional university complex. That's a mouthful. In his valedictory address, it was in his valedictory address that President Eisenhower warned of the military-industrial complex's tentacles, which subvert democracy. He eliminated his reference to Congress, having been warned, which was in his initial draft, having been warned that it was just inappropriate for an outgoing president to criticize the sitting Congress. But let's look at let's look at Congress. Have you ever heard a member of Congress denying or opposing a new weapons manufacturing or a new military base in their district? It doesn't happen. Bringing home the military and nuclear bacon and the jobs, right? That's part of the job of being a member of Congress. That's the expectation. And they don't want to appear to be weak on quote-unquote defense. To speak with authority about the complex, I turn to the leading expert on the subject, William Hartung, who is currently at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft in Washington. Just to say, that's really quite a remarkable think tank. You can go on their webpage and find just amazing, amazing resources. And then, of course, we had the New York Times comprehensive report. As we see in the likely underestimated $1.7 trillion, I have problems with the billion, $1.7 trillion upgrade of the nuclear arsenal and its delivery systems, as well as the weaponization of space and cyberspace, and U.S. conventional weapons dominance, and the more than $100 million that the largest armaments corporations spend for lobbying in Congress. We do, in fact, have this military-industrial congressional university complex, and it survived the end of the Cold War and now the end of the post-Cold War. My reading habits are different from many people's. So when I received the invitation to join you today, my thoughts first turned to Albert Speer's memoir, back when Honeywell's cluster bombs were being used to wound and kill untold thousands of Vietnamese in the early 70s. Speer was Hitler's armaments minister, and he wrote his Apologia as an imprisoned war criminal. Included in the book was Speer's description of his role in Germany's failed effort to build a nuclear weapon and how the Nazis' armament system actually worked. Speer wrote, and I quote, "We owe the success of our programs to thousands of technicians with special achievements to their credit, to whom we now entrusted the responsibility for whole segments of the arms industry. I exploited the phenomenon of the technician's blind devotion to his task. Because of what seems to be the moral neutrality of technology, these people were without any scruples about their activities. The more technical the world imposed on us by the war, the more dangerous was this indifference of the technician to the direct consequences of his anonymous activities." Sound familiar? I have a physicist friend who focuses on quantum computing and the spin of the atom's highest quark. Who knows what a quark is, right? I once asked him how his fellow scientists live with what should be a sense of guilt about their roles in building dimensions of weapon systems for foreign interventionary wars and the nuclear arsenal. Consistent with Speer, my friend responded that they think only of the technical and scientific challenge before them, and not the moral implications. And that, of course, pays for their mortgages. From another angle, Kevin Phillips, once a Republican-oriented journalist, wrote about the Bushes. He reminded readers that beginning with World War I, the Bush dynasty played essential roles in creating much of its wealth in the arms industry. He wrote that, quote, "George H. Walker and Samuel Prescott Bush were the dynasty's founding fathers during and after World War I. Walker," he wrote, "made his mark in corporate reorganizations and war contracts. Sam Bush, W. Bush's great-grandfather, ran Buckeye Steel Castings, which produced weapons, and in 1917, he went to Washington to head the Small Arms and Ordnance section of the Federal War Industries Board. During World War II, W.'s grandfather, Prescott Bush, was director of Gerson Industries. Gerson produced incendiary bombs, which burned 66 Japanese cities to the ground. Gerson also produced gaseous infusion pumps for the Manhattan Project. And later, before becoming president, CIA director, George H.W. Bush's priorities were, quote, U.S. weapons trade and secret arms deals with Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Mujahideen in Afghanistan, part of the system. Turning to the complex's nuclear dimensions, we need to begin with the Manhattan Project. As Hartung wrote, the Manhattan Project was one of the largest public works efforts ever undertaken in American history. At its peak, the project employed 130,000 workers and cost $38 billion into these dollars. One of the factors contributing to Truman's decision to A-bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki was his fear that if voters learned that we had spent that much money on building the bomb and hadn't used it, that they might not vote for him for president in 1948. That wasn't the defining rationale for the atomic bombing, but it was a factor. Today, Hartung wrote, quote, the American warhead complex is a vast enterprise with major facilities in California, Missouri, Nevada, New Mexico, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Texas. Nuclear-armed submarines and bombers and missiles are produced or based in California, Connecticut, Georgia, Louisiana, North Dakota, Montana, Virginia, Washington State, and Wyoming. And when you factor in subcontractors, quote, most states host at least some nuclear weapons-related activities. The New York Times put that number at almost 50 states. Alicia Sanders Zachary, the director of research at the International Campaign to Abolish Atomic Weapons, I should say, I was privileged to have it once it's an intern, recently prepared a report about the roles of universities in the nuclear weapons program. The leading scientists at the Manhattan Project, she reminded us, came primarily from the University of Chicago, the University of California at Berkeley, Princeton, Harvard, Caltech, MIT, Purdue University, University of Rochester, and Iowa State University. Someone might want to research what that connection was. After World War II, when Los Alamos and Lawrence Livermore laboratories were established, much of the work moved off campus. But the University of California and Texas are deeply involved in those labs. Alicia also explained the University of Chicago and California at San Francisco, MIT, Columbia, and the universities of Rochester and Washington, quote, participated in numerous unethical studies about the effects of radiation on human subjects from the 1940s through the 1970s. Let me say a few words about those studies. In the first years that I traveled to Hiroshima, I was frankly shocked to hear Japanese A-bomb survivors and Marshall Islands H-bomb survivors say that they had been used as guinea pigs. They described being forced for years to undergo medical examinations by the ABCC Commission, Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, and by the Marshall Islanders, the 4.1 Project, and they received no medical care. In 2000, I hosted a delegation of global Hibakusha for meetings at the United Nations, and a colleague arranged for an off-the-record meeting for us with the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Energy in Washington. And so what if it was off the record? Some things need to be said. There I explained the charge that the Hibakusha make, that they were exploited like guinea pigs. I offered that it's natural for victims to think the worst of their victimizers. Referring to Dr. Mengele's evil medical experiments on Jews during the Holocaust, I asked if he could deny the Hibakusha's claims. Oh no, he replied. We use those studies for everything, including the design of new nuclear weapons. Also to say, I was at a conference I'm just the guy who puts his pants on one leg at a time. I just took a few risks, and here I am. I was at a conference last March in Japan, and there a academic researcher reported coming across in the archives a memorandum from a fairly senior U.S. official who was advocating the continuation of these studies, right? And he says, the Hibakusha are more like animals than us. Looking more positively, again looking at the military-industrial congressional university complex, a positive step was taken in the Clinton administration when the U.S. and Russia negotiated the comprehensive test ban. It outlawed kinetic nuclear weapons testing, but there was a catch. While the treaty prevents radioactive fallout from testing, it allows computerized simulated tests. And these tests are conducted with the help of university partnerships for the Stockpile Stewardship Program. And in order to ensure the reliability, we'll make sure these things work, of the U.S. nuclear arsenal, and for the development of new nuclear weapons. One more word about universities. As Hartung wrote, quote, "In the decade following World War II, the Department of Defense became the biggest patron of American science. That remains the case, quote, with the DoD's recent focus on developing new technologies like weapons-guided artificial intelligence. Combine that, Hartung writes, with an intensifying drive to recruit engineering graduates and the forging of partnerships between professors and weapons firms, and you have a situation in which many talented technical types could spend their entire careers serving the needs of the warfare state." Almost done. The most recent data we have is from 2022, when 14 universities received at least $100 million in Pentagon funding for their military-related research. And then, of course, there is the congressional dimension of the, I'll say one more thing here, about the complex. One example is the Senate ICBM coalition, which plays a leading role in maintaining and updating the most dangerous lake of the nuclear triad, the land-based ICBMs. These strategically armed missiles are based, maintained, and primarily produced in Montana, North Dakota, Utah, and Wyoming. They are the most dangerous weapons because they are sitting ducks, immovable, and thus vulnerable to a disarming first strike, which means that you have to use them before you lose them. And in that circumstance, they're vulnerable not only to attack, to a computer glitch and a mistake. Former Secretary of Defense William Perry and many others assert that with the naval and bomber legs of the triad, these land-based missiles are not necessary for deterrence, so-called. But the bipartisan ICBM coalition, led by Democratic Senator Tester, keeps begging for money for his re-election, insists that not only maintaining these missiles, but on upgrading the system with new and staggeringly expensive so-called Sentinel missiles. Not surprisingly, Hartung reports that, quote, Northrop Grumman and its 12 major ICBM subcontractors have been busy pushing Sentinel. They spend tens of millions of dollars on campaign contributions and lobbying annually, while employing former members of the government's nuclear establishment to make the case to Congress and the executive branch. And I'll cut a little bit here, but another one of their boondoggles is the F-35, which doesn't work very well, designed both to support ground forces, but also to deliver nuclear weapons. And it's the Pentagon's most expensive weapon system ever. So before closing with more hopeful words, let me briefly add some of the names of U.S. corporations most complicit in preparation for nuclear homicide. And I'll mispronounce a few of them. AECOM, Aerojet, Rocketdyne, Bechtel, Boeing, Babcock, and Wilcox, Charles Stark, Draper Lab in my hometown, Fluor, General Dynamics, Honeywell International, Huntington Ingalls Industries, Jacobs Industries, Lockheed Martin, Moog, Northrop Grumman, Orbital, Ford, ATK, Raytheon, which is also back in Boston, and Textron. It is a pretty serious structure of society. Okay, so let me get to the conclusion and a little bit more happiness, maybe some more smiles. I'm sorry if I've depressed you with this recitation of evil, banal or otherwise. This is not the country or the world that we want for ourselves, for our children, or for our grandchildren. We can take courage and inspiration from the generations of steadfast and courageous struggles for civil, human, women's, and workers' rights in our country and beyond. I mean, people have dealt with evil before. You don't expect instant victory, but you put your shoulder to the plow. And in this vein, I want to speak from some personal experience and promise that the nuclear weapons states are not invincible. It was grassroots and scientific opposition in the forms of vigils, boats defying bans and sailing into test zones, children with strontium-laced first teeth being sent to Congress and other officials, publications, letters, petitions, and so much more, as well as U.S. and other actions from around the world that forced the negotiation initially of the test ban and also of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And as I said before, the NPT requires the nuclear weapon states to engage in good faith negotiations for the complete elimination of their arsenals. That's something we keep pushing on. In the early 1980s, as I said before, a small study group of students and professors at MIT and voters in town meetings across New England launched what became the massive nuclear weapons freeze movement that forced President Reagan to negotiate the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty in 1967. And that treaty essentially ended the Cold War, 2 years before the fall of the Berlin Wall. So in terms of appreciating what social forces can create, we played a major role in ending the Cold War. Today, the leading edge of the U.S. nuclear disarmament movement is the Back from the Brink campaign initiated by Physicians for Social Responsibility. It calls for pushing a verifiable, for pursuing verifiable agreement for the complete elimination of nuclear weapons, renouncing first use, except talking about first use later, ending the sole unchecked authority of U.S. presidents to launch a nuclear attack. My friend Elaine Scarry at Harvard talks about living in nuclear monarchies, and taking U.S. nuclear weapons off hair trigger alert, and ending the $1.7 trillion program. That campaign is now backed by 43 members of Congress and 85 cities and states, so we've got to start. And it was international disgust, and disgust is the right word, with the nuclear weapon states' hypocrisy and double standards in their refusal to implement the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, as well as the searing testimonies of Bakashev. Was quite remarkable to watch in conferences in Mexico and in Vienna. I'll tell a story here. So you had the Bakashev around the world opening these conferences. And the one in Vienna, they took a downwinder from Utah. And she was in her wheelchair. And they took her up onto the stage. And most other speakers, had written texts that they worked from, right? And with the time limit and rest, disregarded here. And they bring her up there, and her first passionate words are, "My government has killed me." And then she goes on to describe what has happened across this country, especially in the West, with the fallout from nuclear weapons testing. I mean, John Wayne, the actor, died of cancer from nuclear weapons testing. Right? Her talk was so searing. The arrangement, the structure for the conference was that A-bomb survivors and analysts would speak the first day, and governments would speak the next day. Governments weren't supposed to speak. But the American representative insisted on speaking. It was so embarrassing. People were crawling under their desks. It was just ridiculous. But that kind of testimony had powerful impact on diplomats. And we should appreciate what that is, and therefore, again, to appreciate what Bakashev had done and why they got the Nobel Prize. And then to conclude, to say that something that people can do if you've got a pension, get money in the bank. There's a campaign, international campaign called Don't Bank on the Bomb. You can Google it. It tells you which institutions have investments in nuclear weapons production, and you can move your money. And already millions and millions of dollars have been moved from companies doing this. Then to conclude, to say that several years ago, Noam Chomsky remarked that we know how to overcome the existential dangers of nuclear weapons and climate. emergency. The question, he said, is whether we have the will to do so. I've had the rare privilege of participating in UN disarmament conferences, a rare privilege. And in every one, the Vatican ambassador has been uncompromising in condemning nuclear weapons and calling for their abolition. And we have the Archbishop in Santa Fe, Webster, who's been exemplary in working to eliminate this existential danger. So I want to encourage you to draw on those traditions, to take strength from the Hippocrates, to know that every one of us has very real power. As you work willfully to work with your neighbors, your communities, to do what we can to eliminate this danger, but also, obviously, to stop the killing and the wars that are going on, and to build a more just society. Thank you.